And Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow is prepared to resume peace negotiations with Ukraine. Putin's remarks come at a time when Ukraine claims a series of diplomatic and military gains, including long-range strikes deep inside Russian territory. But Putin also underlined his conditions. Any future talks must be based on the Istanbul framework of 2022, as well as what he called the current realities on the battlefield. Listen to this.
Russia is ready for peace negotiations with Ukraine on the basis of the agreements reached earlier in Istanbul, which I remind you were initiated by the Ukrainian delegation at the time. That means everything suited them. I see no grounds for us to depart from these agreements. But this should be on the basis of the agreements reached in Istanbul, on the basis of the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and most importantly, on the basis of the realities on the ground.
The Russian president also accused Kyiv of trying to improve its negotiating position through attacks inside Russia, but insisted that developments on the ground tell a different story.
Everything done about it by the Kyiv regime that I have just mentioned is aimed at one thing only. It is to create favorable conditions for themselves should the peace talks that were interrupted by Ukraine start or rather resume. They want to enter talks from so-called position of strength. What kind of position of strength? At most, this could be about creating the impression of such a position because the realities on the battlefield look entirely different.
While Ukraine has in recent months expanded its deep strike campaign targeting infrastructure far from the front lines. Earlier this month, drone attacks targeted energy facilities in and around Moscow, with images showing large fires and plumes of smoke coming from a refinery. Kyiv has also intensified operations around Crimea as part of its strategy to disrupt Russian logistics and isolate the peninsula. Russian-appointed authorities in Crimea said that recent drone strikes caused widespread power disruptions in parts of the region. The Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries have forced Moscow to ban exports of gasoline and jet fuel. It is also considering a diesel export ban, with reports even hitting a possible fuel imports to tackle shortages, especially in Crimea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has praised his country's strike forces for what he called precise operations, arguing that the campaign is increasing pressure on Russia and raising questions about the cost of the war.
The majority in Russia is already complaining to Putin that this war has no end in sight. All the current difficulties for the Russians should bring them closer to the idea that this is their war. It is not just a stone from the sky, and that their war must end.
Now, the Istanbul agreements refer to a draft peace framework negotiated between Russia and Ukraine in 2022. Their proposals envisioned Ukraine renouncing NATO membership in return for security guarantees, while leaving the status of Crimea and parts of Donbas to further negotiations. Putin also referred to understandings from discussed last year in Anchorage, Alaska, between Putin and US President Donald Trump. Russia claims that these understandings involved freezing the front lines and limiting Western military support for Ukraine. Ukraine has consistently rejected any settlement that requires territorial concessions, but much has changed since that meeting. Moscow now says the United States is ceasing to be an impartial mediator, arguing that Washington has moved away from what Russia describes as the spirit of the Anchorage understandings. All right, and to discuss more from Kyiv, we're now being joined by Dr. Lara El-Roslicki, founder of Black Trident Defense and Security Consulting Group. And from Berlin, we're now being joined by Mr. Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. Thank you so much both for making time for us and joining us on the broadcast now. After more than 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, fresh signs of diplomacy have emerged amid the growing pressure on Moscow. And President Putin has said that Russia is ready for peace talks with Ukraine based on the Anchorage and Istanbul agreements. Now, Dr. Roslicki, could the war finally be heading towards a settlement and peace, according to you?
No, because nothing has changed except for the number of people who are being killed every single day on both sides. And if we had placed a snail at the border of Ukraine and Russia at the start of the war, that snail would have already crawled across half of Poland. Just to give you insight of how slowly the Russian Federation is invading, although very effectively killing a lot of animals and people.
Right. And having said that, Mr. Aris, Ukraine remains cautious, and this is to say the least, and this is for good reason. Although those negotiations in Anchorage that Putin had mentioned, also in Istanbul, it did not result in a final agreement, but Moscow continues to reference that framework as a possible basis for future talks. However, we understand that Ukraine's situation has changed significantly since those discussions took place. Now, my question is, why would Ukraine willingly return to a position where it was less strategically advantaged than it is today, Mr. Aris?
Indeed, I agree that the talks are going nowhere, that what we're hearing is a lot of rhetoric. Neither side wants to be seen as a warmonger. Both of them want to be seen as the one willing to do a peace deal. And yet the two sides are stuck in their respective positions. And on Putin's side, that is guaranteed no NATO membership, all of the things that were outlaid at the Istanbul meeting in 2022, and specifically that Putin is insisting on taking control of the parts of Donbass that he doesn't already control. For Zelensky, that's completely unacceptable. He's not going to give up any Ukrainian territory whatsoever. And he's dug his heels in. He said it's a red line. He won't cross it. And so neither side is prepared to budge. And so what we're seeing now, and the videos you're showing, is just this grinding away military campaign of destruction. And it's escalating, but it's not strategically military bringing the war further forward. Increasingly, the strikes are symbolic, such as when the St. Petersburg investment conference was on, that Ukraine hit some oil assets just outside town, so the delegates went into that meeting, with black smoke in the sky. And the same thing with the huge attack on Moscow just last weekend. It's not going to bring the war to an end, but Zelensky's making the point that Russia is vulnerable to these long-distance drones it has, and is going to keep pounding away until both sides get tired of it, to the point where there will be some sort of talk. And Zelensky's in a very difficult position because while he has these increasingly effective long-distance drones, they don't have the power of missiles, and Russia is churning out, dozens of missiles every day, and those things are really destructive. So Zelensky can damage the oil refinery.
Right, we hear you, Mr. Aris. Now, these statements, of course, come from the Kremlin at a time when it is facing fuel shortages, and, of course, this is spread across parts of Russia. There are restrictions which are tightening in Crimea, and both sides continue to battle over the future of Ukraine's territory, its security, and, of course, its sovereignty. But Ukraine is clearly raising the cost of war for Russia. Now, the question is, will this lead to concessions from Russia, or could it escalate to conflict? Dr. Roslicki, why don't you take this one?
I think that both are possible. We do see a growing escalation and a return of very serious rhetoric from the Kremlin regarding the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. I would not put it beyond the Kremlin to do such a thing. But we should also focus on the sanctions, the growing number of people who are being added to the sanctions, the corporations that are being added to sanctions directly related to the Russian businesses, state-owned businesses, but also businesses abroad that are cooperating and helping the Russian Federation overcome the sanctions themselves. So we have to have that international community really focusing on cooperating and realizing what the serious threat of the Russian war is, not only to Ukraine and the agriculture and fertilizer and energy sectors, but also to humanity, which apparently has very little meaning these days in time.
I hear you, Dr. Roslicki. Now, Mr. Aris, of course, I want to get your opinion on this as well. Do you think that this would perhaps lead to concessions being made by either side, or do you think this could escalate into a wider regional conflict?
Well, Zelensky's very effectively raised the cost of the war to the Kremlin. I mean, the economy in 23-24 grew strongly, and this year it's already gone into recession in the first quarter. And the budget deficit is blowing up as well. But it's turning into a game of chicken. I mean, the Ukrainian economy is in even worse shape, and it just got a $90 billion loan from the EU, but that's only 2/3 of the money it needs. And Zelensky said there's already a $20 billion shortfall. And so what's going on now is like, who can, sit this out longer? Who can take the more economic pain? And Russia's economy is 3 times the size. The sanctions have hurt, but, it continues to export $100 billion worth of oil every year, and there's money in reserve if it needs to. It's starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel, but it's nowhere near collapse. And that's the thing, they're just going to keep grinding away. I think both sides can keep this war up for another 2 years, and it's just going to become increasingly painful. And Putin himself has made it clear that he's not going to make any concessions at all. So I think the ball's in Zelensky's court. I think his economic problems and social problems as well, with corruption scandal, etc., and the lack of manpower, are going to tell, in so much as I think Russia has more time than Ukraine does. But Putin wants to bring this war to an end. His people around him in the Kremlin are increasingly divided between the hawks and the doves, who want to finish this or see it through to the bitter end. Putin seems impervious to that pressure, but if there's a deal that can be brokered, if the States returns to the negotiation table, there is a possibility of finishing this war before winter. And if it doesn't finish before winter, then Russia's going to return to its previous winter campaign by bombing all of the power assets flat and trying to freeze Ukraine into submission.
Right, we hear you, Mr. Aris, and while I agree that both sides do want to end this war, their definitions of peace and victory are very different here. And now Putin has accused Kyiv of interrupting the negotiation process earlier. But how do you reconcile Ukraine's, frustration with the slow pace of diplomatic efforts and its concern that the negotiations should not come at the expense of the country's long-term security, Mr. Aris?
Yeah, you put again the finger on the key element here, that one of the conditions that Zelensky needs in order to end this war, and something that would end the war, is if his partners in the West, specifically the US and the EU, offer Ukraine some sort of binding security deal, whereby, the problem here is if he can stop the war tomorrow and give up the Donbass, but he needs a guarantee that Russia can't reinvade in a year's time. And some sort of Article 5-like deal, NATO membership, even EU membership. There's an article there, 42, that would give a collective security guarantee. And if he has that, then he can stop the war. But without that, Ukraine is basically left in limbo. So you could stop the fighting tomorrow, but you have to be able to guarantee that Russia won't invade again in a year or two's time. And that means a security deal.
Right, of course, we'll have to wait and see where it goes from here. But for now, thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your valuable insights with us.